We're doing our study out of the book by Watchman Nee, The Normal Christian Life, and I think this is like our 6th week. And we're starting a new chapter, but I don't think we're going to get very far in it because of what I want to share today out of the series we've been doing for a long time now, weeks, months, law and gospel. People cannot distinguish their Christian lives between law and gospel. Some have come up with the term mixing covenants, an unholy mixture, or where you were living by law and grace at the same time. And Paul is clear on any time that we have that kind of mixture going on, you void out any help from the Holy Spirit. And that would be synonymous with saying what Paul also said in Galatians 5, that you fall from grace. Grace and the law do not mix. It's like oil and water. You got to be a servant of one or the other. And if you look at grace as a power, grace as a person, Jesus, the life of Christ in you, grace as the Holy Spirit enabling you, all those help, all those different aspects, terms, help us understand the life that's in us. Grace, the Holy Spirit, Christ, the Spirit of Christ. All those are synonymous in a sense in helping us understand grace. Law is anything that you do in and of yourself. It comes from you. It doesn't come from the life of Christ within. So if you got this mentality that you're going to do 50% and God's going to do 50%, I'm sorry, you're doing 100%. God's not going to add to your works, and He's definitely not going to let you add to His. He's not there to give you a helping hand. He's there to live His life through you as you rest in that life. He doesn't need your work. In fact, He ended your work. He ended your humanity. He crucified your flesh. So what help can you give out of that which has been crucified? So we can't look to ourselves in any way, shape, or form, in any degree, in helping God out in respect to our lives and our sanctification. Now, we're looking at the book Watchman Nee, The Normal Christian Life. I encourage you to get it and read along with us. And we're on chapter 10, and we're not going to get through this chapter today, or it probably will be in it for a couple weeks. I want to read one aspect. We're going to jump down to the topic, the flesh and the spirit, because I want to share something, and this is why we're not going to get very far in the book today, because I want to share something that relates to this, something the Lord dropped in my spirit early last week. He starts off saying the flesh is linked with Adam and the spirit with Christ, meaning this, that when you are born of the Spirit, he who is joined to the Lord is one spirit. So when you're at regeneration, that's the born again experience, when you got born again, your spirit came alive and joined itself to Christ who lives in us. So we're born of the life of Christ, born of the Spirit. Again, interchangeable terms. So my spirit and the Spirit of Christ, Christ in me, has become one. So my spirit is linked. He uses the word linked. But you can also say joined. Or you could use what Romans 6 in some translations, planted together. It's a oneness. However, prior to your born again experience, you're in Adam. There's no life of Christ in you. Your spirit is dead. You're fully alive in the flesh, and that's linked to Adam. Once you're born again, God crucifies the flesh, placing His Spirit in you, making the flesh no longer a power to deal with, a dictator to deal with, because He says we're no longer debtors to the flesh. Now, the flesh is still there. It's dead in the sense that it has no more jurisdiction over you, influence over you, power over you. And if it does, it's simply because you're still not living fully out of the grace that's there. And thus we have the battle between the flesh and the spirit Paul talks about in Galatians chapter 5. where he says the flesh lusts against the spirit and the spirit against the flesh. Now here's where I want to go. He says the flesh is linked with Adam and the spirit with Christ. And then he asks the question, am I living in the flesh or in the spirit? Now in Romans chapter 8, he tells us in verse 9, however, you are in the spirit. Now, just give me 5 minutes because I don't want you to get confused. Paul, at times, when he's talking about the flesh, he's talking about your unregenerate self prior to being born again. And that's what the very verses in chapter 8, those who are in the flesh cannot please God. In other words, he could have easily said, those who are not born again cannot please God. Then there's times when he talks about the flesh as the person born again, who has that struggle of Galatians 5, where the flesh lusts against the spirit and the spirit against the flesh. When we become born again, he doesn't take out the flesh. It's still there. Same principle as when he put the children of Israel in the promised land. He didn't take out the enemy. He left it there. And they had a continual warfare of driving the enemy out, as you and I will have a continual warfare of subduing the flesh. So we're not a debtor to it. There are days, to be honest, your flesh is in control and you're weak in the spirit for whatever reason. And there are days that you're strong in the spirit and the flesh has no say-so. So the question he asks here, as a believer, are you living out of the flesh? And the flesh, by the way, let's have a side note here. The flesh can be religious. Don't be mistaken. The flesh can pray. The flesh can give. The flesh can witness. The humanity side of you can engage in religious activity. And that's the wood, hay, and stubble that God talks about that gets burned up at the judgment seat of Christ. Those are your works. However, if what you do as works derive out of the Spirit, out of grace, that's the precious stones that endures the fire at the judgment seat, and the result is rewards. So the flesh can be very, very religious. Look at your Eastern religions. They put us to shame when it comes to disciplines. But this is all flesh. They have disciplined the flesh, no different than what the Dark Ages called asceticism, where they subdued the flesh. They beat it with sheer willpower. Now understand something. Sheer willpower goes a long way in religion, but when you get to the judgment seat of Christ, it gets burned up because it didn't come from Christ. It came from Adam. The flesh that was linked to Adam. That still remains. Though Adam is dead and the flesh is dead, that's been crucified, it still remains to be dealt with by the Spirit, by grace. Grace is the remedy to the flesh. They both can't work together. Willpower, self-effort, and grace cannot work together. One was given to remedy the other. And that's why it says you're dead to sin. You are no longer alive to it in Romans 6, because you're under grace. Grace is the answer to sin. Grace is the answer to law. Grace is the answer to the flesh. Keep that in mind. So when he makes this statement, are you living in the flesh or in the spirit? I want to talk to you about something the Lord brought to my attention months ago. I don't even know how long ago. I haven't ever talked to it. I think I may have mentioned it to maybe just a few people, but definitely nothing over the internet or to the church. I was having a conversation with a friend. Now, this is a true story. Now, this is a lengthy story, so just bear with me because it has to do with where we're going in the weeks ahead. And I want to start off with it today. I had lunch with an old friend that I grew up with in church. And he was telling me, and we were talking about different churches and different things we were hearing and talking about religion and how it fails, how the institutional church has failed us as it continues to fail others. He has never returned to it. And I surely haven't. So we were talking about a true story. Now I'm going to paint a picture, and I want you to hear it. Because although this is an isolated incident, it's happening all over the church. There was this, I guess I'm just going to share it in a story, because it's really an eye opener to what's going on in churches today. So let me just get into it. There's a guy, I don't know, maybe he's in his 30s. He gets saved. He has a big name in the city, and everybody knows his life prior to being born again. Not a very good guy. But he gets saved, and everybody rejoices. He's well known in the city, and everybody rejoices at this guy getting saved. He does well in a business. He's wealthy according to the standards of the area. He's wealthy and very influential, very, very, very charismatic, and right off the bat, within a year, he's involved in the church. They got him in a leadership position. He's training. Now, this evolves now. I mean, now, so he within a year, he's in a leadership position. He has a ministry in the church. He's being used. And now this is evolving in years. So after a couple years, he begins to train people to be leaders. So he's starting to train leaders. And his tactics are old covenant. Let me pause. If you're watching the message Sunday morning, I said you want to watch the midweek, because I said that a person doesn't have to change. And I'm not talking about forced change. I'm talking about the natural growth of a born-again believer. But he doesn't have to change. He could stay the exact same way he is and use his fleshly tactics and hide it under the guise of ministry, under the guise of church, and be applauded not under the new covenant, because you can't get away with this stuff under the new covenant. Now, you may be thinking, where are you going? And it may sound like I'm jumping around, but trust me, this comes together at the end. People can get away with their fleshly tactics, such as manipulation, intimidation, domination, coercion, shame-based ministries, guilt-based ministries, condemnation, and be applauded for doing all those things, and they can only get away with it under the old covenant. Because I saw it. And I saw what it did to a very progressive, not in the political term, not using the word progressive in the political term, but a very growing, on the cutting edge type church. So this guy starts training leaders. Here are the tactics. Everybody has to be here every Sunday, or you're not a Christian. Or if you are, you're a very poor excuse for one. And I can't believe anybody who wants to be involved in church, who wants to be in ministry, can't be here on time. Or can't be here at all. And right away, man, here comes the Hitler-esque to his ministry. He's a dictator. He's a dictator with his friends. He's a dictator to his wife. And he hides it under the new covenant, and the church can't see it. They see it as a great, strong leader. They see that as a strong leader. But anybody who understands the nature of the Lamb, that is not Christ. I can't believe you did that. You don't. For instance, I want you to speak. Well, I can't speak. I told you I would speak. You're using me as a leader, and I'm just using me as an example. And I said I would speak. I'm just showing you the tactics. I'm showing you how you can be this way in the church under the old covenant. The old covenant allows you to put on a mask and be a hypocrite. I'm going to show you why here in a minute. But law, for instance. So anyway, yeah, I'll speak for you. Well, something comes up. I don't know the future. So something comes up in my family, and so I can't do it, and now I'm treated differently. Now I got to sit in the back pew. I'm not called on to pray now. I'm not used now. I have to now pay my dues for a mistake I made, which wasn't really a mistake. It's just that I couldn't jump through that particular hoop because I had another engagement come up that was more important than speaking to these kids or whoever, whatever the ministry is. You can get away with that stuff in the old covenant. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. You didn't do what I want you to do, now take a back seat. And when I feel like you're worthy to be used, I'll bring you back up to the front row and I'll start using you again. Now, in other words, you're in timeout. See, manipulation is when you force somebody to do something or be something they're not willing or ready to be yet. And you're trying to get them to be a certain way, so you'll use every tactic you can to get them to be what you want them to be. You'll strong arm them. Look at Nehemiah. Now this is under the old covenant. He rebuilt the wall. Ezra came before him and got him spiritually ready. Nehemiah comes after Ezra to rebuild the walls that had been broken down by the enemy to secure the Jerusalem. Now they've got the temple and they've got the sacrifices, they've got the spiritual aspect of it set. Now they got to build the walls for protection. So everything gets done and they go back to sinning. They're committing horrible acts of sin. And understand, that's what judgment came on Jerusalem prior to that. And God launched them off in the 70 years captivity. After the 70 years, Ezra comes in. God raises up Cyrus, lets them come back home. God puts it in their spirits to come back. God sends Ezra for the spiritual part of it. Then when Ezra's done, God sends Nehemiah, and they're ready to start over again because they were under the judgment of God. Well, they go back to sinning. They get all this done only to return back to sin. And it's recorded. You read it. Nehemiah gets them in headlocks and starts pulling their hair, making them stop sinning by force. It's a mob mentality. You know, a mob comes into a community and they start strong arming the businesses. You'll pay us this, or we'll put pressure on you. We'll put violence on you. It's the same thing with Nehemiah. Nehemiah wasn't wrong because Nehemiah was operating under the old covenant. At whatever cost, don't sin. If I got to beat you, and if you're doing something that's going to bring all of us under judgment, we're going to kill you. We're going to stone you. And they were allowed to do that. The old covenant is a failed covenant. Not that God failed, we failed it. And it was given, the law was given to show that I don't care how much hair you pull out of somebody's head, they're going to keep sinning. I don't care how many laws you put on people, you're not going to change them. And this man, with this Hitler mentality, you'll do what I say or you can't be part of our crowd. If you don't jump through these hoops, you're not one of us. And he used manipulation, intimidation, and domination. And he was a bull in a china shop. And this went on for years. And he, influential in the city, I knew the pastor knew this, but it was a bittersweet deal. He may not have liked his tactics, but he's the most popular, one of the most popular men in town. In politics too, makes decent money, and he's an asset, not a liability. But in the kingdom, he's a liability and definitely not an asset. But he was allowed, by hiding behind the old covenant, with his Hitler tactics, and browbeated a church for years. We're talking about this at lunch, me and my friend, don't forget. True story. You have lived this probably in other churches where a senior pastor let loose one of his lay people to lead people, and that dude was reckless. He did not minister out of the nature of Christ. He ministered out of the flesh. And that's what Watchman Nee is saying here. Are you linked? Are you living in the flesh, or are you living in the spirit? If you're living in the flesh, I can't tell if I'm old covenant mindset, if I'm living under the old covenant and the church is old covenant, we'll never know who's in the flesh. Because we can hide behind religion, and the flesh can be religious. Now, let me pause again. And again, referring back to my Sunday morning message, just a piece of it, when I sidebarred this, I said, you can't get away with these Hitler tactics, and you can't get away with manipulation, intimidation, domination in a Buddhist mentality, in a Buddhist religion, for example. Though I'm not promoting that, but if you understand anything about some of the Eastern religions, they're very peaceful, humble, gentle people. I mean, number one, that's their culture. Asian people are more humble. It's their culture, respectful. You take a guy like I'm explaining and throw him into a Buddhist religion, they'll spit him out. They may not kick him out. He'll leave. He'll realize he doesn't fit. And he'll go find a place where he does fit. You take somebody who's peaceful and you are aggressive, and your aggression does not move their peacefulness, you don't win. After a while, you're going to go find somebody who's aggressive too so you can fight. You ever try to fight with somebody? Proverbs says, when you return kind words to somebody evil, and I'm paraphrasing it, it's like pouring hot coals on their head. So if somebody's trying to fight you or debate you with an adversarial spirit, aggressive, and you respond with the nature of the lamb, you diffuse them. And then they'll just walk away because, see, they're looking for someone to fight with, and if you refuse to fight, and they'll say, oh, and they'll just walk away. See, if this church was New Covenant, church I'm giving you this story about, if it was New Covenant, and it was manifesting the life of Christ, the nature of the Lamb, nobody would tolerate this bull in a china shop, this reckless Hitler with his tactics. Now, I'm not condemning him. He didn't know any better. This is how he operated in the world. And this is what I'm talking about, the Old Covenant, the law. The way you operate in the world, you can operate in the church under the Old Covenant mentality because the law hides you. For instance, Jesus said, I have never murdered anybody. I've never committed adultery. I've never done this, that, or the other. Well, that qualifies me. Now, of course, you never know what's in my heart. And we can put a mask on under the Old Covenant and be a certain way in front of people, but in our hearts we're something totally different. Because, hey, I've done the 10 Commandments, so hey, I'm doing the law. I'm better than this guy. I've never done this. I've never done that. Alcohol's never touched my lip. I've never smoked a cigarette, and I've never had sex. I have never fornicated. Now that qualifies me under the Old Covenant, right? See, this guy went on for years doing this in the church, raising up leaders. Now, he ends up leaving the church, forced out, for whatever reason. By then, the church has grown tremendously. He's out of the church. So we'd be like that Wizard of Oz, the Wicked Witch is dead. The Wicked Witch is dead. But the problem is he's raised up other wicked witches now, who's carrying on. He's passed the torch on. And now the leaders are implementing those Hitler tactics in the church. Now watch this. This is the conversation I had with this guy. Years after this guy has left this church, though his influence, his Hitler influence has remained. Years later, that same very scenario that I shared earlier. So here's this kid. He's in a junior high ministry, and he wants to be part of junior high kids and ministering to these kids. He's probably in his late 20s, early 30s. And the leader over the junior high kids has been raised under this guy, this Hitler guy who's no longer there. who's still implementing his tactics. Not ministering the Spirit, ministering the tactics. And that same scenario, he asked a friend of mine, hey, can you speak to the junior high kids Sunday night? He said, yeah. Well, in the midweek, somebody died in his fiance's or some, I don't know, girlfriend, fiance's family. He has to be there for her. So he calls up the guy who's in charge of the kids and says, hey, I'm not going to be able to speak because somebody in my friend's family died, and I gotta be there. He says, really? You made a commitment. I can't believe that you're going to do that when you made a commitment to me. You made a commitment to those kids. I thought you loved those kids. I thought you were committed to those kids. And now you're just going to bail out? He said, dude, hold on. I can't help it. Somebody died. I don't care. I'll tell you what, buddy. You'll never minister to these kids again. Is that the nature of the Lamb? Is that ministering the Spirit? Is that ministering grace, or is that ministering law? Now, if he'd go to the senior pastor and say, hey, well, did you made the commitment, didn't you? See, you can't bend the law. If you're working with people that are law-minded, you can't win. The law is what it is. There's no grace. There's no mercy. It doesn't bend for you. It won't try to understand your plight. It just condemns and judges and then moves on, leaving you behind. You understand what I'm saying? So I was in this church. 10 years, and thank God he delivered me out of it. So I go pastor a church who's totally the opposite. They would go, oh, somebody died, that's okay, we'll find somebody. They don't manipulate, they don't intimidate, they don't dominate. If you don't want to do it, that's fine. We'll trust God to raise up somebody. It was like a total different culture. Now, although they weren't into grace like I preach today, they were way more on the side of grace than this church I grew up in. And as the story that I told you is a real life story of a particular church, I grew up in a church like that church. You probably grew up a church in that. And every church has its Hitlers. Every church has the guy who's in the flesh, who uses tactical flesh tactics to get the work done. He does not rely on the Holy Spirit to speak to the people. He uses force. You'll do what I say, or you can't be part of this. He doesn't give people time to grow. He doesn't know that there's a process of growth and sanctification. He wants instant saints, perfect according to his ways, and you toe the line or get the hell out. But, going back to that story, this guy's long gone and his influence still remains. How many years later? I heard a story in the church just recently. This guy has been gone out of that church since the 90s. Here we are, 2017, and his presence and his influence and his tactics remain in a very large church. How do you rid that church of that Hitler spirit and its fleshly tactics that Galatians 3:1 calls it witchcraft? Who has bewitched you? And that is manipulation, intimidation in order to dominate. And whatever tactic you can use to get people to obey, to get people to line up, to get people to toe the line, we'll do it. See, grace is sloppy, not in that the message is sloppy, but it's sloppy in this. Grace deals with sinful saints. It doesn't cut them off. It patiently works with them in spite of their sin. Churches don't want to work with you in spite of your sin. They're ready to cut you off when you cross their proverbial line. And every church has its lines, where grace has no lines. Grace works with you no matter who you are and what problem you have. It loves you. It continues to abide in you and works patiently The life of Christ continues to work patiently in you, transforming you, working in you God's good pleasure. Old covenant churches cut you off every single time. Now, I hope you got that the way that I'm getting it. Maybe I'm failing in trying to show you you can get away with anything like that in the Old Covenant. See, hypocrite. The word hypocrite comes from the Greek drama, where a guy would get on a stage and put a mask on and criticize everybody in the audience, hiding his own identity. See, under the Old Covenant, in my heart I can be however I want, and then come to church and be a totally different guy and get away with it. Number two, I can use the fleshly tactics of manipulation, intimidation, and domination and get away with it because I'm getting results. Hey, I know I hurt people's feelings, but hey, I got 100% attendance in the prayer meeting. And the pastor comes and says, where's all these people coming? Well, you had a Hitler force them to show up. And the pastor, he has to watch. The senior pastor has to watch because, hey, his tactics may be a little different, but look at the results that he gets. And you understand something. True story. When I was in my early 20s and just got into the ministry, I was part of that kind of a church that I explained. And the head deacon would get us young guys to take up the offering. And so we would show up in our suits and he'd make sure we the whole thing. But there was a string attached. He also wanted you to come to the prayer meeting that the men had on Saturday nights. Now, I'm 19, 20 years old. And the men that are showing up at the prayer meeting are in their 60s and 70s. Maybe some 50s. They're old men. I went to a few of them. And it's like, I'm just looking around like, it wasn't for me. Right or wrong, even if it was right to be there, I wasn't there. God had not done that work. God did not call me to that prayer meeting. God did not inspire me, my will to action. Grace did not bring me to that prayer meeting. His Hitler tactics did. And this is the head deacon who also was under a Hitler leader. See, it just breeds itself. And if I did not show up, if I wanted to go out with my friends Saturday night at 19 years old, 20 at the most, if I wanted to go out with my friends that Saturday night, I'd show up Sunday morning, he'd walk right by me as if I was invisible because I didn't come to the prayer meeting. What is that? That's manipulation. What he's saying to me is, I am not your friend, don't talk to me because you didn't come to the prayer meeting last night. So I'm like, I just got snubbed. And I know why. I didn't show up to the prayer meeting. So I thought, well, I guess I got to get him to the prayer meeting next week. So Saturday night, I show up. Hey, Greg, how you doing? That's Saturday night. Sunday morning, I show up. I'm walking down the hall. Here comes the head deacon, and buddy, his hand comes out there. Brother, good to see you. And I'm like, okay, I got your number. I know exactly what you're... Now, see, I did not know anything then about manipulation, intimidation, and domination. Witchcraft, Galatians 6:1. Who has bewitched you? I didn't know anything about that. I didn't even know what bewitched meant. But I knew I was being played in a way that wasn't right. So again, another Saturday night comes by and I'm like, nah, I really want to go with my friends. They asked me to do something. So I did. Sunday morning, I'm ready. He comes down through there and buddy, he snubs me again. I saw the pattern. And then I began to think, okay, here we go. I know what's happening in this church now. If you don't jump through their hoops, you can't be part of them. Not even in friendship. They'll just marginalize you. So now I'm on this performance treadmill. To the youth pastor, to the head deacon, and whoever else was in leadership. All the while the pastor, he has to know this is going on, he lets it. He did not, the senior pastor did not operate this way. That's the mind-boggling thing here. So you think that the head pastor, the nature of Christ in him would trickle down. Oh, no, 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 no. What trickled down was the Hitlers he put in leadership. And it's almost like a competition. Who could manhandle people the hardest? Who could have the best, the biggest, the most workers, the biggest ministries, and use whatever tactics you got to use. When I was in youth group, these leaders hated rock music. Despised it. Always browbeat me over my music. I was a senior in high school. We went to a camp. I drove. And other people drove. But I drove and I had my music in the car. Well, one of the leaders gets in my car because they know I'm listening. I hate that rock. They get in my car and take my music. I had a box. You remember the old, this is back in cassettes and 8-tracks. You remember the containers that you could get and they had those little slots in there. I'm not lying to you. I'm just showing you what you can get away with under the old covenant. And so you know how most churches minister the old covenant versus not ministering the new. So they take my tapes. I get in my car and I'm like, now we're talking hundreds of dollars. You know, a cassette was like back then $8, and you got 20 of them in there. You're looking at $160. And as a youth who didn't have a job in school, where's my tapes, man? So I'm thinking maybe my friends are just screwing with me. They're like, no, man, they knew not to touch my music. Anybody who knew me and knew how much I love music, don't mess with his music. And they're like, no, man, we didn't touch that. So someone says, I know who did it. I saw him get in your car. I said, who? I'm thinking it's a youth. It's an adult. A grown-ass man. Guy in his mid to late 30s. Now, to me, that's a grown-ass man because I'm only 18. Not even 18. Maybe just turned 18. 17 or 18. To me, that's an old person. Who should know better, by the way. I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. So I go and say, hey, man, you take my music? He gets this crappy grin on his face. I'm like, I want my music back. That's rock music. That's the devil. And I just started this crap. He wouldn't give it back. In his mind, this is how he was going to rid me of rock music, steal my music, throw it away. And I tried all day long to get him to give me my music back. Now you think, what's the big deal? It is a big deal, man, because that's my property. Someone goes into now this is the church. We're not talking about a secular camp of a bunch of heathens. I get that. Hell, he'd lie to me and steal my music. I would expect that from heathens. But they think that they're going to keep me from listening to rock music by going into my car, stealing my music, and then refuse to give it back to me? My property? I don't care if it was devil music. We're talking about a higher principle here. You stole. You sinned. You're calling me a sinner, and you sinned because you've become a thief. All the horror stories you hear coming out of youth groups. People who have no business ministering to youth. They're just as immature as the youth are. So I couldn't get my music back. Now, God has always given me the ability to win battles. And that's why I always had a bent. I probably should have been a lawyer had I not got saved. And you could probably tell that by my teachings, because I always do my teachings as if you're my jury. I know by the grace of God I could have been a great lawyer. That's just not my calling, but I have that bent. So I just sat there and I looked at him. All day long I tried to get my music back. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, okay, he's got this smart ass grin on his face. Thinks he's got me. And I'm like, hey, you going to give my music back? He ignored me. And I'm like, all right, that's fine. but you're going to get a call from my mom and dad who paid for that music. Because I don't have a job. Where do you think that money came from to buy those tapes? I said, that's fine, but you'll be getting a call from my mom and dad when I get home, and I tell them that the money that they spent for me to have that music, you stole. And I walked out. I'm telling you, God is my witness, within minutes, my music ended up back in my car. I went and looked, and there it was. There's my case with all my tapes in it. That is not how you get people to change. By intimidating them, by manipulating them, by dominating them. I could tell you horror stories, because this is the kind of a church I was brought up in, and not only can you get away with the old, you know, in the church that way, you can get away with that in a denomination. You can get away with Hitler tactics in a denomination that I was a part of, the Assemblies of God. And you can get away with so much like that kind of stuff. Because, see, you're trying to, you know, in my mind now, I'm like, how can you get away with it? Because I'm so grace-oriented now. I'm like, again, not that the Buddhists or anything are great. I'm not condoning anything from that religion. But I'm using it as an example. You can't get away with these Hitler tactics in a very peaceful religion. Being very aggressive with people in a very humble and gentle culture. You can't do it. You can't do it. And I'm like, where I'm at today, how do they get away with it? And it's like foreign to me. But when you're in it, it's not foreign. They get away with it, and you can't figure it out. You can do so. You can use fleshly tactics. And again, this is all I'm using. The first question, are you in the flesh or in the spirit? And I'm using it as leadership in the church. You can't do that with husbands and wives. Let me get to the husbands and wives in a minute. But let's go to if it can happen in a church, it can happen in a denomination among its own leaders where they intimidate. Do you realize when I was in the Assemblies of God, they had what you call the 16 tenets of faith. And you had to line up with every single one of them. I don't even know what they are now. But I know one that I did not line up with. Two of them I did not line up with. The rapture and eternal security. Of course, I believed in eternal security. They didn't. And those were two that I couldn't line up with. Now, had I preached because I believe it's truth, had I preached non-rapture, had I preached eternal security, they could have my papers. They don't present. Now, I believe that there has to be orthodox Christianity. In other words, Jesus is the Son of God, the Trinity, the atonement, all the basics, yeah. But when you start getting in the peripheral, like when the end times, my God, you're going to take somebody's papers over a different take on the end times. What does the end times have to do with salvation, preaching and teaching and making disciples? Absolutely nothing. But we're going to divide over eschatology, end time doctrine. And I'm just like, if you preach that, we'll have your papers. You don't know how many times I heard that in the Assemblies of God, not just to me, but to other ministers. That's how they keep their ministers in check. We'll take your papers. That's Hitler tactics. And all denominations have some type of that control. It's all about control. Control, control, control. That guy I talked about earlier, the bull in the china shop, is all about controlling people. And he'll do and use whatever he can to get everybody to line up to what he wants, the way he sees it ought to be, giving nobody room to be different, or giving anybody room. For instance, a pastor walks up to a guy and says, "Hey, I want you to be a deacon." And the guy said, "Nah, man, that's not really what I'm called to do." Now, as I understand, a deacon is a servant. And an elder is one who governs. A deacon serves the church. An elder governs the church. And the problem with a lot of churches that are set up like that is that you've got deacons being elders and elders being deacons, and you've got servants trying to govern a place when they should be out there mowing grass, because that's what deacons do. They serve the building and the body. And the elders make the spiritual decisions. They're leading at the church, governing the church, administrating the move of God in that church. And the guy says, I'm not called to be a deacon. I don't feel that's what God wants me to do. And the guy said, well, you'll never be an elder in this church. And he walked away. I'm like, wait a minute. You just can't go there. I understand that he's looking for people who know how to serve to be elders. I get that. But you just can't go and be a Hitler and just chop them off at the knees. The guy may not have the revelation you have. And maybe you say, well, okay, well, let's talk about it. And then get him in the office and say, well, let me tell you my philosophy, how I see it. And I want you to pray about it. No, man. Chop him off at the knees. We've got to stop ministering the old covenant tactics in the new covenant church. It's not ministering the Spirit. It's ministering your tactics. And I'm telling you, the majority of churches in America function under a Hitler spirit of dictatorship, manipulation, intimidation, and domination. Now, there's a good side of this. It's still wrong. I call it the good side of manipulation. It's called flattery. And boy, have I had that happen to me. So pastor wants me to put me in a position, so he's going to well, he may say no. What I'll do, I'll butter him up. Hey, brother, how you doing? Man, I've seen the glory of God on you. You're such a good teacher, and I know God's calls on your life, and we just so happy you're in this church with us, and we anticipate to see what God's going to do. We know this is a God thing. We know God's ordained this moment. We know that God's in control here, and this is all God. I need you to clean the church next Saturday. How do you say no after you've been buttered up like that? Or I was under a pastor in Arizona, and he would try to get me to do something physical. And he'll say something like, yeah, I really don't have anybody to do the books. We're 9 months, and this is a true story. He comes to me, and I did bookkeeping. And that was the job at the time, did the books for this business. And he comes to me, and he finds that out, what I do, what I'm doing for a living at that time. And he comes to me, because I just moved to Arizona. He comes to me and he says, yeah, we're really behind on the books. He's looking around. We're 9 months behind. And the board has really been on me, and I just don't have time. And then he'd stop, and then he'd have his glasses down like this. And then he'd look to see, is this working with me? And then I knew where he was going with this. I was like in my mid-20s. I knew where he was going with this. 9 months and tried to receipts. You understand how much work we're talking about, and then not finding and then not lining. I'm telling you, we didn't have computers back then, so it's all handwritten on a ledger. And I'm just like, man, I don't want to do this. And he's like, I just don't know what I'm going to do. I just really need help. And he'd just look to see. He'd look down and look up just to see if this is working on me. The new covenant way is, I say, you know what, let me pray about it. And I'd say, God, is this what you're doing? Is this what you want? Are you going to give me the necessary grace to do these 9 months of back book, 9 months back, this bookkeeping? But no. That's not what they don't pray about it. If you don't want to, that's okay. See, that's how, if that's not what, that's okay. I'm going to trust God to raise somebody up to help me. Or I'm the one who should not have let it go bad for 9 months. Then I've got to suck it up as the pastor and do my job. I mean, that'd be the thing to do. Oh, I did it. And you cannot believe how frustrating it was and how long it took to get that church up to date in their books. But that was the beginning. That was where I saw that. He worked that on me. The whole time I was there, he worked it on everybody, though. I watched it. And I called him the master manipulator. So I had enough. And I can't give you the whole story, it would take forever. And I've shared this story half a dozen times already, but I'm just going to give you a synopsis. I had enough. I'm leaving. So I go to him and I said, hey, me and my family, we're going to leave the church. We just feel like God's calling us out. And it's the thing to do, because I can no longer support you. I didn't tell him this. I'm just saying I can't support this man. It would not be right for me to stay in a church where I couldn't support the man or the message anymore. This is all under the Assemblies of God. And I'm like, we're just going to leave. Now, I don't know. Maybe I'm dumb, but I thought I was living in America at the time, where it's the land of the free, and that I had the choice to do whatever I wanted to do. If I wanted to go to that church, do I not have that freedom to go to this church A, church B, church C? Hell, I even have the choice not to go. I think that's America. This is in 1988. And, they had a book out, 88 Reasons Why Jesus is Coming Back. Remember that book? And everybody thought Jesus was coming back in 1988. I had 88 Reasons Why I'm leaving the Assemblies of God. But anyway, I said, I'm leaving. He goes, no, you're not. I was taken back. I'm like, what? He goes, you're not going anywhere. I'm like, what are you talking about? He goes, I'll have your papers if you leave this church. Now, if you knew anything about hierarchy, he's the pastor, I'm not. I was his associate, but it wasn't really something that was on paper per se. But even if I was the associate, I ought to be able to leave and resign. And I'm like, what? He goes, I'll have your papers. And I knew that he could. I'm like, well, and I backed off. Because I'm like, I was taken back. I have never had, this guy was a master manipulator, man. So I went back to my family and I said, and my friends, I'm like, he said I'm not allowed to leave. I'm like, what? This is foreign. So I get a phone call from the executive presbyter of that area. They have their hierarchy, the AG. And I said, good, I'll go there and I'll tell him what's going on, man. Surely he'll be on my side. Freedom? I mean, last I heard, it was like the Spirit was supposed to lead and guide me, not man, and definitely not a denomination. I went there and I couldn't say one word. He had me pegged, or he had the situation pegged. The guy had called him. And he just said how I need to stay, how I need to support the guy. And I didn't get a word in edgewise. And I got to wrap this up. I didn't get a word in edgewise, and I knew what was happening. I'm being played. So I didn't say nothing. So I went back, sat on it for about a week. By then it's been 2 weeks. And I said, the most important thing to me, if I'm called, and I am, the most important thing to me is to be able to hear the Holy Spirit and do what He tells me to do. Take the revelation the Holy Spirit gives me and share it. And if you want to censor me teaching what the Spirit gives me that I can prove by the Bible, that's not heresy. You may not like it, but it's not heresy. It's not your flavor, or it's not your take. I get that. That's why we have different churches and different flavors. But overall, I get that. But I'm as a minister, and I'm only like 25 years old at this time, and I said, as a minister, if I am not free to go where the Spirit tells me to go and to preach what the Spirit tells me to preach, I'm out of here. So I go back. I made my decision. I'm resigning from the Assemblies of God. I'm getting nowhere with them. And I even went to, and I'm not. This will take the story out further than where I want to go. One day we'll share it again. I even went to the General Council, not of America, the big one, but the state. I went to the state headquarters in Arizona of the Assemblies of God and sat down with the superintendent. Twice I was brought in, twice in Phoenix, Arizona. Twice I was brought in. To make a long story short, I'm like, you can have my papers. So I go to the guy and I said, we're leaving. He goes, what? I thought we had this conversation. No, we're leaving. He goes, I told you, if you leave, I'll have your papers. I said, what his name was. I said, I resigned. He goes, what? I said, I resigned. I don't have papers anymore. I mailed them in. I resigned. He says, you've just ruined your career. I said, dude, it's not a career. I don't know what you're talking. It's not a career. It's a call. And because of the call is why I'm leaving. You're not going to manipulate my call. You're not going to control God's call on my life. And God, in my mid-20s, it was the mid-80s that I got the grace message, and it was in my mid to late 20s that God said, chuck denominationalism. It's flesh. And I'm sorry to tell you this, but if you're in a church, it's denominational, that is flesh, because Galatians 5 tells you the deeds of the flesh, and one of them, if you read the right translation, says party spirits. Paul gives us a hint and says, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Apollo, or Apollos, I'm of Peter, I'm of Jesus. He said, what, is Christ divided? So when you say, I'm Assemblies of God, I'm Southern Baptist, I'm Methodist, do you not understand that's man, that's flesh? Flesh came up with that? Why are we succumbing, or why are we engaging the flesh, religious flesh of man? We continue to do it. And that is what's created the institutional church. Man has created the institutional church. God never meant the church to ever be organized or institutional. He has meant it to be organic. He said the kingdom of God is not down there, it's not over there. The kingdom of God is within you. Christ is in you. And that is the church. It's not supposed to be put on paper. It's not to be about buildings, the Constitution, bylaws, and policies and procedures, do's and don'ts. It's organic, folks. It's spiritual. But man in the flesh has not only ruined it church-wise, he's ruined it individualized. You got the Hitler with individually manipulating people, and you got denominations manipulating churches and their pastors. So when he asked the question, it runs deeper than what you think. When he asked the question, are you living in the flesh or are you living in the spirit? Do you do this kind of stuff in your marriage? Guys will beat their wives or be rough with them or intimidate them. I may not touch you, but when I'm pissed off, I'm going to take a bait. You watch me outside the window. You'll see me in the backyard so pissed off at you that I had to take a bait. True story. And we had a guy in the church that did this. He got mad at his wife, and he took a baseball bat, and rather than hit her, because he'd go to jail for that, he's going to intimidate her with his anger and a baseball bat, and he's going to go out in the backyard and beat the bark off the tree like a stupid maniac. He literally took a baseball bat to a tree in the backyard. She watched him and put her into check. That's putting fear on her in order to control her. He manipulated her in order to dominate her. Same guy got another time. This is a family that we had to deal. Well, I don't know if we dealt with it, but it's a family in our church that he got so mad at her. He got his gun. Kate, she didn't know what he was going to go in the bedroom. She said this was the end with her. He goes into the bedroom. He gets a gun. He comes back out, and she's paralyzed with fear because he's got what? First it was the baseball bat. That didn't work. He's got to up the ante now. He's got to go for the gun. Now it's not loaded. But he points the gun at her and goes click. And she said that was the end. And she divorced him, and rightly so. His ass needed to be divorced. And you will never hear a preacher say this. I believe that a good divorce is better than a bad marriage. And I will go to my grave saying that. Because there is no way in hell that God would ever have you stay with a Hitler, with an abuser. No way. You're going to tell me that if you're dating a guy, well, he's never touched me. But he's touched every other woman in Fairmont. He's got his thing in every other woman in Fairmont. He's coming back with diseases, and you're supposed to stay with him and continue to have sex with him? He's out there throwing his money, gambling and whoring around, and you're going to stay with that? I'm going to tell you something. The church, you can get, see, and the church will say things like this. Well, anyway, let me move on. I'm a gun owner. And anybody and everybody who is a respectful gun owner will tell you never point the gun at anybody, let alone point it at them and pull the trigger, because there could have been a bullet lodged in there. Don't even if you know, they tell you, even if you know beyond a shadow of doubt that there's no bullet in there, you still don't do it. And he pulled his gun on his wife. This guy was a deacon in our church. You've got to be kidding me. Those are Hitler tactics. That's the flesh. And it's all for the purpose of controlling her. What he needed to do, new covenant on this man would have looked like this. Well, I can't change her. I married her. I love her. I can't change her. I got to trust God. Not the gun. Not the baseball bat. Not my tactics. I got to trust the Spirit to speak to her, to transform her. And until then, forbearance, forgiveness, and grace and mercy has to be extended to her, and vice versa. Now, wives do this to their husbands. They hold back sex. They do the silent treatment for 3 days. You know, if you don't do what I want you to do, you're not getting any sex. And you do something I don't like, I won't talk to you for 3 days. These are all Hitler tactics. Maybe not. Maybe I'm wrong using the word Hitler because he was really bad, but it's fleshly tactics in order to control. I am going to manipulate you, intimidate you in order to dominate you. And the church and the Christian church and Christians are full of witchcraft. That's how we minister. We minister witchcraft to each other, not the Spirit of grace. You can take this in bosses. Christian bosses don't know how to treat their employees, so they use these Hitler tactics, these fleshly tactics. Managers don't know how to manage, and bosses don't know how to administrate their business, lead and guide their people. They use these Hitler tactics. I'm talking about Christians. You can't expect nothing from the world. Do you do it in your family? How about your kids? Do you rule your kids by the fear of you're going to go berserk on them? I had a friend that 6 years old, his dad beat him. And he said the first time it happened, his dad, is 6 years old, this big old dad picks this six-year-old up and threw him up against the refrigerator as hard as he could. He said, I hit that refrigerator so hard, he said, I pissed my pants. He said, I'll never forget that. He told me that story. It broke my heart. And I had an 8-year-old at the time when he told me that. And I said, God, never let me ever come close to being anything like that to my kids. There's no way. I thank God that my family didn't do that to me. My mom and dad never did that kind of stuff to me. And they're not perfect, by far, but they were not abusive. But men and women do that kind of stuff to keep their kids in check. Violence. There is a way to raise kids in grace and not law. You as a mom and dad are to minister grace, to minister the Spirit to your kids, not threats and not physical violence. Are you in the flesh? Or are you in the Spirit? Because let me tell you, if you're in the flesh, you're ministering the flesh to your wife, your husband, your kids, other members in the church. And as a pastor, if you're in the flesh, that's what you're ministering. And you will not minister grace. You'll minister your fleshly tactics of intimidation, manipulation, and domination. Coercion. How about shame? We get people to quit doing something or get them to do something by shaming them into it. Not trusting the Spirit. See, the whole thing is we won't trust. Do we not believe Jesus is in these people? Got to ask the question. These people that I'm ministering to, is Jesus in them? Yes. Do they have the Holy Spirit to do the changing and the leading and guiding and the inspiration of their wills? Yes. Then why am I using these tactics? Do I not trust the Holy Spirit in my wife? in my kids, in my parishioners. Oh, they may not jump through the hoops right away. And the question would be, why would you even have hoops to jump through? Just minister Jesus and let Jesus lead and guide their lives. Take away the hoops. You know, you just say, Lord, these are the needs. You raise up the people to meet the needs. You don't raise the people up, we won't do it. I remember, and I got to close, I'm running too late. I remember I was associate pastor of the grace-oriented church. And I said, look, if you've got truth on your side, you can be bold. And I ministered something along the lines of this. And I said, if you are in teaching the children, or you're in the nursery, and boy, we needed workers bad in the nursery, and children's church, and youth ministry. A big church like that, you need as many workers as you can, volunteers as you can get. But I said, if somebody manipulated you, intimidated you to do any of the ministries that you're in, I said, you have permission to resign. Because if the Spirit didn't put you in those ministries, you have no business being there. It's a program to you. And we're not trying to do programs. We want ministries, not programs. And if you've got volunteers that you've forced into positions, they become programs. But if God raises up people, then the program is a ministry. And most of what churches have today are programs because they manipulate the people to volunteer. Whatever tactics they use. How about giving? The tactic of Malachi. If you don't give, God will not rebuke the devourer, and your car will break down. Your kids will get sick, and on it goes, trying to manipulate you to give. God is not a master manipulator. That's old covenant. And you can't do this stuff under the old covenant. You can't. There's not only churches and denominations, but I know of ministries that manipulate. You can't talk to one another. You can't share different truths to one another. You can't share books with one another because they're controlling how you believe and what you believe. That is classic manipulation and intimidation and domination. It's classic control. You're going to believe what we believe. You're only going to read the books we want you to read. And we're so fearful of you not believing like us, nobody can talk to anybody anymore. And these are major ministries playing these games. So it's not just individuals in the flesh. It's not churches just in the flesh. It's not denominations that's in the flesh. It's your network TV ministries in the flesh. These are fleshly tactics. And they have the Hitler S on them. And that's not ministering the Spirit. That's not trusting the Holy Spirit. That's not ministering grace. That's ministering flesh. So when Paul, he quoting from Paul, but when watch my knee, and I told you we weren't going to get very far. This one sentence, I just took an hour to do commentary on this one sentence. Are you in the flesh or in the Spirit? And it is not just something to gloss over, because the flesh runs gamut through every aspect of your life, church, and ministry. So don't just, I purposely, and I didn't, the Spirit, purposely had me stop at that sentence and say, wait a minute, this is huge. And you got to ask yourself, now, because understand, the flesh has been crucified. You're not a debtor to it. So don't deal with it. You stay in the Spirit, and the Spirit deals with the flesh. You don't. It's crucified. So in other words, you no longer have to pay attention to it. You're free from it now to let grace have its perfect work. But this is a huge question. And if you're a pastor listening to me, or you're in charge of a ministry, or you have in the church, or you're married, you have kids, you've got to ask yourself, what am I ministering to these people around me? Is it the flesh, or is it the Spirit? Am I ministering the old covenant, or am I ministering the new covenant? Because the old covenant is condemnation and death. And do you want to kill a marriage? Minister the law. Minister the flesh. You want to kill a church? Minister you can kill a church, and it can be the biggest church in town, but you've killed it. And they're all dead because you've killed them. You've shamed them, coerced them, manipulated them, and that's all wood, hay, and stubble. Everything they're doing is wood, hay, and stubble because they're doing it because you manipulated, not because the Spirit told them. Can you imagine Joel Osteen's church? Biggest church in the country, doing greater works, more works than anybody else, but it's all being wood, hay, and stubble because they're doing it out of religion, not out of the Spirit. They're doing it out of law, not out of grace. I'm not saying Joel, I'm just saying a church like that. If you got a big church and you're doing great things in your community and they've given you the key to the city and you've got plaques and things on your wall for all the great works you've done for the city as a church, given to you from the city council or whatever, and the mayor has come to your church and spoke and applauded you, affirmed you, and thanked you for all the good works you're doing. But if that pastor used fleshly tactics to manipulate you to do those good works, it's wood, hay, and stubble. Because if those works you did in your city were not because the Spirit told you to do it, it's wood, hay, and stubble. That's why in Romans chapter 14, the very last verse, it says, things not done in faith ends up being sin. So you can do a good work. A good work is sin if it's not from faith. And how does that work? When the Spirit tells you to do something, faith comes, and you step out and do the good work, and you got a reward in heaven. But if you were manipulated to do it, or you did it with false motives, hey, if I do this, I'll get the applause of men. See, motive is a big thing. Motive speaks about your good works. And if you got a bad motive, wood, hay, and stubble. So if you're doing this stuff outside of faith, which is a result of what the Spirit tells you to do, he says it's sin. Read it, Romans 14, last verse. Chapter 14, last verse. So again, and I'm done. This is a huge question that every Christian has to look in the mirror and ask for, and be totally honest with oneself. Am I in the flesh or am I in the Spirit? Where do I live out of the most? We'll continue this, and hopefully we're going to get a lot further next week reading out of the book by Watchman Nee, The Normal Christian Life.